Hello and welcome to a brand new Arseblog Arsecast right here on arseblog.com. How are you? Hope you're well. I hope that you and yours, your nearest and dearest, your friends and family are all keeping safe and well in these strange, trying times that we're living in. We're all doing our bit to try and slow down the spread of COVID-19, the coronavirus, and hopefully everyone listening to this is in a good, safe, healthy place in body and in mind. Mind is important as well because for a lot of people there's been a big change of routine, and that can be something that's difficult to deal with. Hence the reason that there is another podcast today. I'm trying to keep everything as normal as possible, as on track as possible. So the routines from work might have changed, your childcare routines, your kids might be home from school when they should be, out all day and not under your feet. But hopefully with the podcasts, we can just have this little corner of what was normality, even if it is in your ears for 45 minutes to an hour every Friday and Monday. And of course, with some special episodes dropped in there as well, like we did this week, the interview with Cesc Fabregas, which I have to say has produced the most amount of feedback to any episode I have ever done. And I've been doing this show since 2006, and we've had some fantastic guests and some fantastic episodes, but in terms of the feedback and the way people have reacted to it, it's been unbelievable. So I just want to thank everybody for that and for all the comments. I've had lots of emails and I've tried to respond to every single one of those emails. If I haven't yet, I will get around to it. On social media, it's much more difficult. There's just like my Twitter timeline since Monday has just been like... So, there it's impossible to reply to everybody, but I have been reading them, and I just want to say to all of you, thank you very much. On Instagram as well, I've tried to read them, but it's weird. The message thing on Instagram is weird, and I did notice a couple in there which, are asking me questions, and I have no problem with answering questions and with doing that for people if they want to get in touch, but please don't send messages that way. It's much better to email. My email address is on the website. You can use the contact form on the website, or you can just send an email. Just go to the page on arseblog.com, which has the contact details on it. Send me an email. It might take me a little bit of time to get around to it, but I will definitely answer your email and I will answer your query as quickly as I can. It's just that if you send messages on Instagram, and some of them you have to press buttons to see who's sending you stuff, and then you have to click, and it's hard to type on phones. I don't like doing a lot of typing on phones if I can help it. So if there's anything important, or if there's anything you want to know, or if you do just want to get in touch, just send an email. I prefer email. I like email. It's nice. It's polite. It's sort of there, and I can deal with it as and when I get time to deal with it. And I always do get around to answering people's emails. So use that, please. And again, just thanks a million for listening, and thanks for sharing it, and especially thanks to people who kind of stuck up for me a bit when the snippets from the interview were being pilfered and put online without any accreditation. I've got to say that for the very most part, a lot of the big news organizations that took things from the interview did give a credit and did give a link back to the website within the articles themselves. It wasn't necessarily always apparent in the tweet that they might have sent it. They might have put a headline, Fabregas, this, that, and the other, and it wouldn't necessarily mention Arseblog, but in the article itself it did. So thank you to those guys as well. There have, of course, been people who have taken the content of the interview and used it for their own content without even a word or a hint of where it came from. Those people can go and fuck themselves. And on the way back from going to fuck themselves, I hope a bird shits in their mouth. And I don't mean a sparrow, I mean a fucking ostrich or something like that. But what can you do? Some people are just wankers. To new listeners who might have listened to the Arsecast for the first time with Cesc and are now tuning in, welcome. It's good to have you along. I can't say that they're all quite as, exclusive and in-depth and former Arsenal captainy and stuff like that. We do podcasts on a range of stuff, but they're all special in their own way. They're like children. Some of them are better than others. You love them all, but you might like one better than the rest. What can I tell you? This is Audio Child number 571. And it is difficult to, follow up an interview like that with someone like Cesc Fabregas, particularly at a time when there is no football, there's no transfer rumours, there's no matches, there's no nothing going on there's no nothing going on. There isn't anything going on from a sporting point of view, a football point of view. So all you can do is look behind you into the past. And that's what we're doing today. Because in the late 70s and the very, very early 80s, Arsenal played in 3 FA Cup finals and a European final, 1978, 1979 and 1980. We reached the FA Cup final 3 years in a row, and we reached the Cup Winners' Cup final in 1980 as well. I thought we might look back on those games and that period in Arsenal history. Okay, maybe it wasn't the most successful, but still interesting, and a lot went on, and I know that many of you listening to this lived through it and potentially don't want to relive it, but there are also people listening who weren't even born and who are aware of what happened, but maybe not quite how. So I thought we'd look at those finals, and I'm delighted to welcome back to the show someone who has written many books about Arsenal, including Rebels for the Cause and the excellent Red Letter Days, 14 dramatic events that shook Arsenal. It's Jon Spurling. Hi, John.
Hi, Andrew. How are you?
I'm not too bad, thanks. 1978. Arsenal reached the FA Cup final. And maybe just put it a little bit in context. In 1976, Terry Neal, a former Arsenal player, had taken over at a very young age. I think he was only 34 or 35, having previously managed some team down the road. And obviously this came in the wake of the Bertie Mee era and what have you. But maybe just set the scene and tell people a bit about what Arsenal and football was like in 1978.
Yeah, so in the mid 70s, Arsenal really flirted with relegation on more than one occasion. They had some talented individuals like Alan Ball, for instance, and they had Brian Kidd. But I think that Terry Neal's best ever signing really was Don Howe, who was coach when we won the double in 71, and he brought him back. And what he was able to do is to mould a talented group of individuals into a team, and also oversee the kind of emergence by the late 70s of the London Irish, of Liam Brady, of David O'Leary, Pat Jennings, Pat Rice, Frank Stapleton and others. And I think that was really what pushed Arsenal towards those 3 FA Cup finals.
In 1978, the path to the final, when you look at it, is it looks relatively normal compared to what's to come in 1979 and 1980, which of course we'll get to. A comprehensive win over Sheffield United in the third round, and then there were wins over Wolves, Walsall, Wrexham and Leyton Orient in the semi-final. So, on paper now, looking at it through the prism of 2020, those are teams that you would, pretty much expect Arsenal to beat.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I've got the list in front of me there, and I think that what it's notable for is Malcolm MacDonald's amazing goal-scoring run. I mean, he scored twice against Sheffield United. He scored against Wolves, he scored against Walsall, he scored against Wrexham, and then in the semi-final, sort of older Arsenal fans might have seen this. He scored 2 goals which are credited to him, and I think it was the second one took a double deflection of Orient defenders, which of course Malcolm MacDonald kind of claimed anyway. I think also notable for that cup run is Willie Young, who had taken time to win over the hearts of Arsenal fans because he, like Terry Neal, came from Tottenham, but he scored a key goal, a delightful goal at Wrexham, which really did raise his profile and raise his popularity with the Arsenal fans. But like you say, the run to the final, if the runs to the finals in 79 and 80 were dramatic, this run was the opposite because it was so straightforward.
The final then facing Ipswich Town, managed by Bobby Robson.
Yeah.
What was the feeling going into that game? Because, for me, 1979, certainly the final or the cup run I'm aware of, in terms of listening to games on on the radio on the way, but watching an Arsenal game, 79 is the first one I remember. But 1978, what was the feeling going into that game? Was it a case that Arsenal were strong favourites? Did the Arsenal fans expect, I mean, as much as you can when you go into a final, was this a game that they expected to win?
The expectation when they beat Orient in the semi was that Arsenal would win, but there were two problems really, in that both Liam Brady and Malcolm McDonald were not fully fit. So by this time, Malcolm McDonald's knee was starting to cause him huge problems. And in the final, I mean, you can see that he is put through a couple of times, but can't move because his knee had locked. And by then, he was having to kind of waggle his knee around to get his cartilage unlocked. It's not a pleasant story, and very sad to see such a striker continuing. But I think the key thing is that Liam Brady played, but wasn't fully fit. And afterwards, Liam Brady said that, you know, it was kind of like his biggest regret in that he played in that final, but there was no way that he could do himself justice because of his injury. I think the other interesting kind of subplot to this, which is often forgotten, is that Alan Hudson played in that final as well for Arsenal. Now, Alan Hudson was another superbly gifted midfielder, but didn't get on at all with Terry Neal. He was like a loose cannon, really, at Arsenal. And so he did play in that final, but again, did very, very little on the day. And Ipswich, I mean, I think John Walk hit the post twice, Paul Mariner hit the bar before Roger Osborne scored the winner. And so Ipswich were definitely deserved winners, but I think you can't help thinking that if MacDonald and Brady had been fully fit, that Arsenal should have won the FA Cup that year. They were bitterly disappointed, and it's a testimony, I think, to Don Howe's coaching and Terry Neal's kind of gusto at that time that the team regrouped and were able to come back next year.
In terms of the game itself, the winning goal from Ipswich came quite late.
Yeah, that's right. It was David Geddes who kind of put the cross in. Willie Young kind of was at sixes and sevens. It was one of those loose drilled in balls that defenders find a nightmare, and it kind of went loose to Osborne, who slammed it home. Osborne was so overcome he fainted afterwards. So I think to recall, he had I think 25 relatives were bussed in from Ipswich because he's a Suffolk boy, and I think that's the only thing the Arsenal players kind of thought of, is that Ipswich were a nice club, if you see what I mean, and their fans were, Ipswich are not one of their major rivals. So I think that was about the only positive that could be said of it for Arsenal, I think, that day.
So Pat Rice, I think it's said afterwards, that Arsenal were lucky to escape with just a 1-0 defeat. And it's interesting when you look at the Ipswich team sheet on that day, there are a couple of names that will stick out from an Arsenal point of view. Paul Mariner, who you mentioned, of course, joined the club at a later date, but in midfield, a man called Brian Talbot, who played for Ipswich that day and was part of the Arsenal squad the following season. I mean, do we know, was it off the back of that particular game or that performance that made Terry Neal bring him in?
Yeah, I mean, Don Howe and Terry Neal had their eyes on Brian Talbot for a long time, because he was the kind of a dynamic kind of box-to-box midfielder whom they wanted. So I think they'd had their eyes on him for a year, but he was exceptional that day. And I think the way he coped in the heat, those bleached out turfs in the 70s at Wembley with the heat in the background, they were very, very impressed with how he played in the cup run and during that season. Yeah, because of course Ipswich won their semi that year against West Brom at Highbury, in the year that when Arsenal and Highbury used to stage semis.
That's true. I mean, I think in the modern era, people are used to seeing semi-finals take place at Wembley. And one of the great things about the FA Cup, certainly, when I was growing up, was the fact that the semi-finals would take place at different grounds, at a neutral venue, around the country in England. And, I'm not saying I am saying I think it does spoil it a little bit when you're playing a semi-final at the venue where you should be playing the final, and particularly back then when Wembley was sort of like the iconic ground to get to. Playing a semi-final at Old Trafford or Villa Park or Highbury or wherever it might be, I think really added something to the tournament.
That's right. I mean, in '78, Arsenal played their semi at a dilapidated Stamford Bridge against Orient. I mean, '79 they played at Villa Park, and then in 1980, with those multiple semis they played, the final replay was at Highfield Road, where Coventry used to play. So, no, I agree. It made Wembley a more unique kind of occasion, and it added a bit more flavour and colour, if you like, to the cup run. The fact that the semis were played elsewhere. No, I agree.
So 1979, going into that FA Cup season, people are aware of the concept of replays in cup competitions. I think newer fans and people who haven't lived through the era of replay after replay after replay might find it a little bit hard to get their heads around the fact that in the third round, Arsenal played Sheffield Wednesday 4 times before progressing to the fourth round. There were the initial tie and then 3 replays. It's incredible.
Yeah, I mean, it's football at its rawest and kind of almost its most brutal. I mean, I'm just, again, looking at the dates in front of me, that they played Sheffield Wednesday on the 6th of January at a frozen Hillsborough. Britain was locked in it was the winter of discontent as well, where the rubbish hadn't been collected in some parts of the country. Graves weren't being dug because of the strikes. And Pat Jennings, the goalkeeper, the Arsenal goalie, was pelted with ice, not even snowballs, ice balls by those lovely Sheffield Wednesday fans on the Hillsborough Cop. And it literally was a fight to the death. I mean, they played those 5 games within, I'm just working it out here, 16 days.
Wow.
So five games in 16 days. The first on the 6th of Jan and the final one on the 22nd of January. And there really, really wasn't much in it. I mean, Jack Charlton had Sheffield Wednesday very, very well set up. I think that in the end, I'm just looking at the final one there. It was Frank Stapleton and Steve Gatting that finally finished them off at Filbert Street. Leicester City's old ground.
That's because the replays it used to toss. Was that not the case, that you toss a coin to see where the next game was being played?
Yeah. That's correct. And because of the frozen conditions as well, I mean, that was the year where Arsenal, they played 1 league game only in January against Forest, and there was nothing for the month. So it really was all about the FA Cup. It was an incredibly intense experience for the players. And I think that, afterwards, David O'Leary said how exhausting the whole thing was, because Arsenal players knew the FA Cup was going to be their best chance of glory, and I think the FA Cup was more valued in those days as well. So yeah, that's a key element to it.
There's something else, isn't there, when you have to play the same team over and over again? And even now, if sort of the fixture list throws up something strange, like you could have a league game home and away against somebody, within 6 weeks now, but you might get a cup game somewhere in the middle, and playing a team 3 times in, let's say, 6 or 8 weeks feels a bit like, oh, not them again. But when you play the same team 5 times in whatever you said, it's from the 6th of January.
15 days.
It is. They must have hated the sight of each other.
Yeah, I mean, it was insane. I mean, some of the players, they said they saw more of each other, if you see, the players, than their own families, because it was all about, play the game, travel to the next one, play the game, travel to the next one. The FA actually did debate before the final replay at Filbert Street about a coin toss or a penalty shootout to decide who would ultimately go through. They decided against it. They thought, no, it should be a fight to the death. But it's testimony to what the FA Cup was like in those days.
Yeah. So look, eventually, the sequence of results was 1-1, 1-1, 2-2, 3-3, and then a 2-0 win
at
Filbert Street for Arsenal to take us into the fourth round. A 2-0 win over Notts County, then a win over Nottingham Forest, and another couple of games against Southampton. There was a replay there after an initial 1-1 draw.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's two interesting points come out of that. In that Brian Talbot made his sort of FA Cup bow against Notts County in late January, but I think that the win away at Forest, who were league champions and would win the European Cup that year. I think that's possibly the most underrated Arsenal victory of that era, because there was a lot of talk that Clough wanted to win the FA Cup. And going into the game, Forest were in decent form, but Frank Stapleton scored a superb header. He sort of twisted his neck.
He was good at that,
and arced the header past Peter Shilton, who didn't even move, and it was in the mud at the City Ground. And I do think that's probably the most underrated Arsenal victory of that era. I think there's grainy clips of it left on YouTube, but it was a fantastic victory.
2-0 win over Wolves in the semi-final, which set up a final against Manchester United. And as I've said to you, it's the first game I really remember, and it's one that, as a kid, I remember recreating the goals up and down the hallways of the house, much to my mother's unhappiness as the ball went slamming into cabinets and cupboards and doors and all that kind of thing. But, it's a very, very famous final because of the way that it ended up. But for a long time, it looked as if it was going to be a fairly routine Arsenal win.
It did. I mean, there's an interesting little aside to it in that before the game, George Mayle, who played for Arsenal in the 1930s, he did a bit of scouting for Terry Neal and Don Howe, and they sent him to watch Manchester United to see if he could sniff out any weaknesses with Man United. And what he said is that they're a decent team, Man United. They weren't exactly all conquering in that era, but their main weakness was that Gary Bailey, the goalkeeper, was not that confident on crosses. And so George Mayle suggested that if they could test him out in the air, then it might prove to be an ace up Arsenal sleeve, really. And in the first half, I mean, it went so smoothly with you had Talbot and Sunderland arriving together. David Price screwed back a loose ball. It was a really, really well set up goal. There's still some who argue who got there first, Talbot or Sunderland, but it was credited to Brian Talbot, and then Frank Stapleton's kind of bullet header, and then. The jitters, it wouldn't be Arsenal, would it, without a major jitter in the second half. I mean, some say quite harshly perhaps that the introduction of Steve Walford as a substitute kind of disrupted Arsenal's flow, which is probably true. I think Willie Young has said that, and David O'Leary as well. But I think their legs had gone. I mean, that the heavy Wembley turf on a blisteringly hot. It was
a hot day, wasn't it? Yeah,
it's a long game, and I think that really did cause them some issues. But then Arsenal's winning goal. I mean, it's the dynamism of Liam Brady, who knew that if it went to extra time, Arsenal would probably lose. He drove forward. Pinpoint cross from Graham Ricks, but then the George Mayle thing about Gary Bailey on the cross. I mean, Bailey is all at sea for that cross, isn't he? He is nowhere. And Alan Sunderland's superb finish, I guess, and no one ever quite knows what Alan Sunderland did say as he wheeled away after scoring that winning goal. But for me, probably like for you, if we're roughly the same age, I'm very late 40s now. His kind of butterfly blue collars fluttering in the breeze as he's running away, cursing, is my prime memory of Arsenal as a child, and will always be, I think.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of go back a little bit, it's 2-0 to Arsenal until the 86th minute, and I do remember distinctly thinking, this football thing is great. This is brilliant. Like, we're going to win the cup final, and there's nothing anyone could do about that. And then Gordon McQueen scored in the 86th minute, and Sammy McIlroy scored in the 88th minute, and all of a sudden it's 2-2, and you're thinking, what the hell? And all I can remember, I think, or we can all remember rather, Liam Brady socks down around his ankles because he was absolutely knackered, and he played it out to Graham Ricks, and the cross came in, and Sunderland was there at the back post. He had the energy to get in and score that goal. So, I think we've all experienced this in football since, but for your first real football experience to be like this roller coaster of, oh, this is great, oh, Jesus, this is terrible, oh, fuck, it's great again. It's sort of I don't know if it sets the tone for your footballing life in some way. Like, you can learn lessons from those 5 minutes about how quickly things can change in football.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I never, ever take Arsenal winning for granted. And I do think it's rooted in that afternoon in May 1979. No, I think you're absolutely right. But it does add to the list of achievements that Arsenal have had, where they somehow do the business, if you like, in the very last minute. You think of the number of dramatic games Arsenal have been involved in. Anfield '89, the Sampdoria semi-final in 1995, where last minute heroics do see us through. And as you say, it does. I think maybe that '79 final is Arsenal in a package. For me, it is the archetypal Arsenal match.
It is,
and I think it will be. It's still my favourite memory, actually, of being an Arsenal fan, is that '79 Cup final. Partly because the FA Cup, as I say, was such a glamour competition in those days, but partly because of the sheer drama surrounding it.
Yeah, I mean, again, maybe to put it in perspective for some younger listeners or newer fans, back then there was not a great deal of football on the television. There was Match of the Day on a Saturday night, and live football as we know it now just was not a thing. So the FA Cup final and the FA Cup itself, it really was a hugely glamorous competition, a big day. Like you, I'm sure, can remember coverage on the TV starting at 9 in the morning, and they get on the bus with the players and they go, through the streets and all kinds of interviews. And if I could be remembering this wrong, but it wasn't a case that it was just one channel that had it. If I remember, BBC would have some stuff on and ITV would have some stuff on the same day. Am I misremembering that?
They'd almost be competing against each other for viewers. It's like you say, I think, I'm just trying to think of the live games that were available then. FA Cup final, European Cup final, I remember, because obviously there were a lot of English teams involved at the time.
World Cup.
And World Cup, the home internationals as well. Apart from that was it. I mean, I remember one. I think it was Tony Gubber on the morning of the FA Cup final on the BBC, and he talked to Willie Young, who doesn't really suffer fools gladly, and he talked to him about what had happened the year before. When he said, could you have done better with that ball that eventually found its way to Roger Osborne? And Willie Young just said no. And that was kind of like the end of the interview. Willie Young didn't like being reminded of what had happened the year before. But finally, he got his he got his revenge. He made up for that with a great display in '79. But I think the other thing worth saying is that, of course, all the matches or all the ties in the third round onwards were played at the same time on the same day, apart from the replays. And I think that did make the FA Cup weekend more special. And if you look at what happened last month, I think every single fifth round tie was on a or fourth round tie was on a separate day, or was split up during the week, and it does demean the competition, I would say. Yeah,
look, there are other things that have impacted the importance of the FA Cup down the years. The increase in Premier League live football, the Champions League. There was European football back then, of course, but the European Cup was only open to the winners of leagues, so you could have something crazy like Liverpool playing Bohemians, who won the Irish, the League of Ireland, perhaps, things like that. So there wasn't this wall-to-wall thing, and it was a competition that was really prestigious, and I think maybe that's why it sticks with us, and other people can be a bit more dismissive of it because they've grown up in a different generation, and that's fine. But I think that's why, if you are of a certain age, it's definitely a competition which resonates. And, that 1979 FA Cup final, like you, it's really memorable for me. As you get older, memories start to fade, but that one's pretty indelible.
That's right. No, it absolutely is. I mean, we're lucky as Arsenal fans in that Arsenal have won the FA Cup so often. But I think that there are some Arsenal fans who kind of regard the FA Cup now as a lesser competition. I understand that view, but I find it sad though, because the 1930 FA Cup final, the Graf Zeppelin final was the first trophy Arsenal ever won. You have the 79 final, the 71 final where we completed the double. Every time we've won the FA Cup, it's been a key turning point in Arsenal history. Not just it's another competition we've won, and then of course 2014 when we won the FA Cup was the first time in 9 years that Arsenal had won a trophy. So I always looked at the FA Cup as being massively important to the club. But I am an Arsenal fan of a certain age, and I know that not everyone shares that point of view anymore. Sure.
And look, that's fine. We all have our own experiences of it and everything else. So look, 1980 Arsenal, because they've won the FA Cup, they're into Europe and they're playing in the European Cup Winners' Cup. Again, which is sort of the equivalent of the Europa League now. The two competitions, the UEFA Cup and the Cup Winners' Cup, were merged to make the Europa League some years ago. But the Cup Winners' Cup was on the agenda in 1980, and we're going to talk about that. But again, I suppose it's only right that in the FA Cup campaign, we kick off with another replay, this time against Cardiff.
That's right. I mean, there were replays against Cardiff, then there was a replay against Bolton as well. And yet again, Arsenal were playing against very, very well set up lower division clubs who did not give an inch. I mean, I know that away at Cardiff came pretty close to knocking out the FA Cup winners, Arsenal, and they drew 1-1 away at Bolton as well. Frank Stapleton rescued us, but Bolton put us under enormous pressure for the whole game, showing just how seriously everyone took the FA Cup in those days.
So yeah, third round, 2 games against Cardiff. Fourth round, a 2-0 win over Brighton. In the fifth round, 2 games against Bolton, a 1-1 draw and a 3-0 win. The quarterfinal is a 2-1 win over Watford, and then we get to the semi-final. It's Liverpool, and again, this is something I remember not having seen it, but having listened to it. And having had to listen to it kind of surreptitiously, because some of these replays were on in the evenings, and you're supposed to be in bed as a 9 or 10-year-old, but you've got a little radio going on, and you're desperate to hear what's happening. 4 games against Liverpool before we reached the final. I suppose it's worth putting in context how good Liverpool were and how dominant they were around that time. In the 70s and the 80s. Liverpool, as good as people look at them these days, were just the team in English football.
Liverpool were unstoppable in those days. They were, as a team, almost perfect. They had everything. They had pace. They had skill, and they had that tough centre embodied by Graham Souness and Jimmy Case, which meant that they were a formidable unit. I always remember Alan Hansen talking about it. He was talking about a modern team that lost 3 on the trot, and as he said, we never lost 1 on the trot. They were, almost unbreakable. But I think what I love about those semi-finals between Arsenal and Liverpool is not that they were classic occasions, but it kind of embodies the fact that Arsenal may not have been challenging for the league, but as cup competitors, they were absolutely superb, and they knew that they were willing to go the distance and stick it out. And they played what I would say they regarded the semis as almost like a game of chess. The main thing was not to lose, and they would take their time and just to avoid being knocked out.
Yeah, the other thing to say about this stretch of games, if I'm right, is that At the same time as they're playing replay after replay against the best team in English football, there's also the Cup Winners' Cup semi-final going on, a two-legged affair against Juventus, who, of course, are one of the biggest teams in European football, a club which we'll talk about, Liam Brady, etc. now in a moment. But when you look at the dates, from the 9th of April through to the 1st of May, Arsenal played Juventus, Liverpool, 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 Juventus, West Brom, Liverpool, Liverpool. It's an incredible run of games. So before we get to the Juventus thing, let's just look at the games that brought us through to that final in 1980 against West Ham.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the player that kind of emerged from the pack in the semi-finals is Alan Sunderland. I mean, Alan Sunderland is not perhaps regarded as an Arsenal great, and yet if you look at his scoring record when he came to us, he always did the business in big games. So he scored the hat-trick at Tottenham in Christmas '78. He, scored a double at Manchester United the season earlier. The bigger the match, the more likely he was to put on a good show. And I think the '79 Cup final showed that. But in two of those replays, the first replay and the second replay, it was an Alan Sunderland goal that actually saved Arsenal. And the Liverpool players afterwards, Terry McDermott said in the press, he couldn't believe that Alan Sunderland had never got an England cap playing like that. But he was frustratingly inconsistent. But he went the mile in those semi-finals and was arguably the outstanding player, because they were. And as you say, there's not much footage that exists of those games. There's hardly any. But from the reports that were written, they were hugely cagey, defensive affairs. Always the attacking threats came from Dalglish and McDermott at one end, and Sunderland and Stapleton at the other one. But by then, Arsenal were looking tired, and Alan Sunderland was the one who stayed fresh, I think, during that semi. But there are extended highlights of the final replay, where Arsenal won at Highfield Road, and you can see that both teams are literally going at each other in quite a pacey and innovative way. They still look reasonably fresh in that key game.
It's just an amazing amount of football to play. And again, that sort of war of attrition when you're playing the same team over and over again. It's like you're second guessing things. Are they going to do this way this time? Are they going to change something up? And again, the sight of, those players and such a good team like Liverpool, very physical team as well, because they could put it about.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Liverpool were obviously going for a double. And I seem to recall, I may be wrong here, I think Arsenal's winning goal came from a mistake. One of their players fell over in the build-up to it. Well, it might have been Ray Kennedy. I can't quite remember. But one of their players fell over. There was a good cross, and Brian Talbot scored a superb diving header. But of course, they had to then hold out, for the rest of the game. And I remember Brian Talbot saying that Arsenal just sat back and soaked up. It was almost like a rope-a-dope tactic, They just sat on the rope, and tried to hit Liverpool on the counter. They didn't quite have the legs for that, but they just about saw Liverpool off. I think another interesting little anecdote on the back of that is that before that run of games you mentioned, that Arsenal, because of their heavy schedule of FA Cup and Cup Winners' Cup games, wanted to postpone the North London derby with Tottenham. But our lovely neighbours wouldn't allow us to do that. So Arsenal had to field a very inexperienced team at White Hart Lane. On the 7th, they played Paul Barron instead of Pat Jennings. They played Steve Walford. They played Paul Davis, that was one of his first games. Also Paul Vasson, who scored one of the goals that day. And of course, that's where the chant comes: "We beat Spurs with 6 reserves," which is always goes down well. But that kind of was the beginning of that huge run of games.
So in the middle of those games, Arsenal have played a Cup Winners' Cup semi-final, and there was a 1-1 draw at Highbury against Juventus. You know, Juventus, an amazing team. And you mentioned Paul Vasson, who was the hero on the night in Juventus, in Turin, scoring a late goal to take Arsenal through to a European final.
Well, that's right. I mean, Juventus had never been beaten at home by I don't think, certainly by any English team. I don't know if they'd ever been defeated in European competition. And again, it was Juventus had drawn 1-1 at Arsenal. It was there was a very, very hard tackle by Bobby Bettiger on David O'Leary, which went right through, smashed his shin pad, and O'Leary really struggled after that injury. There's a lot of bad feeling towards Arsenal in Turin because Terry Neal had labelled Bettiger a disgrace, and there were banners out in Turin, as well as the Roman candles and the fireworks saying Neal is a dog. Hard to imagine anyone hating Terry Neal that much, but there was a lot of angst about it. But it's almost like Juventus didn't seem to know what to do. They'd drawn 1-1 at Highbury, and they didn't seem to know whether to go and kill the game or kind of hit Arsenal on the counter or what. And the Arsenal players said that Juventus disappointed them on the night. They expected more of them. And as it went later on, Arsenal were able to press forward more and more and more. And then again, it was a superb cross by Graham Rix onto the head of Paul Vasson, who couldn't really miss from that distance. But it was a magnificent occasion and a superb Arsenal victory, which I don't think anyone really expected. Even the Arsenal players sort of afterwards were quite mute about it. They didn't almost seem to know what to make of it because they hadn't expected to win there at all. But there were Arsenal, tired Arsenal, suddenly reaching 2 finals, which would take place within a week of each other.
Paul Vasson, unfortunately, died very young in fairly tragic circumstances. And on the podcast in the past, we've had a look at the book, which I think you can still get on online if you like, a Kindle version maybe, or
Stuart Taylor.
By Stuart Taylor. Yeah, it's called Stuck in a Moment, The Ballad of Paul Vasson. So you'll find it around if you want to read that.
Very, very good book, yeah.
So Arsenal are in the FA Cup final. They're in the Cup Winners' Cup final. And we talked, John, about how the end of the 1979 final can give you a bit of a lesson in what football can do to you in terms of how you view the game and how quickly things can change. But I think as well, this isn't a podcast with a happy ending, folks. Sorry. But, to watch/listen to your team lose 2 finals within a few days of each other really gives you a kind of, okay, I see how this thing can go. Okay, I'm in it. I'm committed to it, but I know it's gonna gut punch me more often than not. And I think that perhaps gives you a bit of grounding as well. But first, the FA Cup final. This really was a game that Arsenal were expected to win because West Ham, although now a Premier League club, were in the what was then the old second division, and Arsenal were the favourites, and unfortunately it was a day which worked out for the underdogs.
That's right. I mean, I think that had Arsenal not had that backlog of games, they would have beaten West Ham probably 80 times out of 100, if not more than that. But unfortunately, on the day, it's if anyone ever wants to watch it, it's a grim watch. Arsenal are ridiculously leggy. They are really, really struggling. Whereas West Ham look quite sprightly. It's actually quite an even game. There's not really a lot between them. But what West Ham had was they had Alan Devonshire, who was certainly their standout performer on the day, who was able to zip around the Arsenal defence and then you have a loose ball which Trevor Brooking then dived for. I think it was probably the only headed goal he ever scored in his career. Billy Bonds, the West Ham captain, he said to Brooking, "What are you doing scoring with your head?" And Brooking kind of shrugged. Arsenal had very, very few chances in the game. And I guess maybe even more memorable than Brooking's winner is, of course, Willie Young's professional foul on Paul Allen. I mean, it's a period piece, isn't it, really? It
certainly is. You can find it on YouTube. If you look up Willie Young foul FA Cup final, you will see it. And basically, to set the scene for people, Arsenal, I think, is quite late in the game, and Arsenal are obviously pushing up. It's a big Wembley pitch. It's another hot day in May. And Paul Allen, who is the
17 years old,
17 years of age, was he the cousin of Tottenham, former Arsenal player for a second, Clive Allen. He was his cousin. He's racing through on goal. He gets in behind the defence, and from somewhere comes Willie Young charging in and literally just launches himself, takes his legs out from underneath him, stops him going through on goal, and gets a yellow card for his trouble.
That's right. And he's lying prostrate on the turf, Willie Young. The referee comes over and he just holds his hands up and says it's a fair cop.
Yeah.
But Willie Young says that afterwards, Paul Allen said, "No problem, big man. I'd have done the same."
Yeah, of course. I mean, they all would, wouldn't they, at that point?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Willie Young's a Scottish kind of ogre. I remember a figure in that, and Nick Hornby wrote that it's just an archetypal Arsenal experience. Big bad Willie Young hacking down Paul Allen as he's about to go through and make it 2-0 to West Ham. But it kind of sums up the game. It wasn't a vintage Arsenal performance. They had no legs, and it was the only way that he was ever going to stop Paul Allen was by doing that. But it was a thoroughly depressing day for everyone concerned. I mean, at half time, Don Howe told the players to get in the showers, cold showers, but David O'Leary said they just had nothing left in the tank.
And that foul by Willie Young, I think, brought in new rules where people say, you know what, there probably should be a greater punishment for a player who's preventing a goal scoring opportunity in the way that Willie Young did there. And well, I mean, there's a little piece of history or contribution to the game from Willie Young that's lasted a long number of years.
Willie Young is quite kind of sanguine about the whole thing. He says it was a good foul. I just tapped his foot. I never hurt him. It was just had to be done. It was a professional foul. He was a professional, and he fouled him in a professional way.
He sure did. So a few days later, Arsenal face Valencia in the European Cup Winners' Cup final game, which takes place at the Heysel Stadium in Brussels. A scene for something much worse in the 1980s. But from an Arsenal footballing perspective, another night where it just didn't go. The heavy legs obviously must have played a part after so many games. I think it was maybe the 65th or 64th game of the season, which is
correct.
It's an amazing amount of football to play. 0-0 after extra time, and the game goes to penalties. Liam Brady missed for Arsenal. I remember being fairly heartbroken at that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, both teams looked tired. I mean, the main contest of the night was between David O'Leary and Mario Kempes, Argentina's 1978 World Cup winner. And Kempes got very, very little out of out of David O'Leary. I think I said Liam Brady. I meant David O'Leary. He got very, very little change out of David O'Leary all night. But apart from that, there was not that much of note. Valencia created the best chances. Alan Sunderland had a decent diving header that was saved by Valencia's goalkeeper. But yeah, it reached that inevitable kind of conclusion of penalties, which again which were almost unheard of amongst British audiences in those days. I can't think of another one that a British club or team was involved in before that.
Well, it didn't work out. Brady missed. Stapleton, Sunderland, Talbot and Hollins scored for Arsenal, and it came down to Graham Ricks, who missed his penalty. So a really disappointing way to end the season from a footballing point of view. And
yeah, it was a real daisy cutter penalty. I think the Valencia goal was called Carlos Pereira. I seem to remember John Motson commentating on it, and it's quite, you have the whole thing. Paul Barron, the substitute goalkeeper, was looking the other way, and Graham Ricks kind of fainted. He was messing around with Carlos Pereira before it and went to feint the other way and kind of made a joke of it. But Graham Ricks looked nervous. And regrettably, his penalty reflected that, and it was quite easily saved. It was a very, very disappointing night.
Yeah, it was, and obviously that summer was a disappointing one from an Arsenal perspective as well, because it was Liam Brady's last game for the club, and I can remember. I don't know if you remember this or if somebody else can remember this at the time. I remember in terms of the FA Cup final, he gave away his loser's medal. And there was a specific term for it in terms of what that meant. I can't remember who he gave it to or what it was, but I always remember in like the football magazines, whether it was Shoot or whatever, they used a specific term, and I can't remember what it was. But he gave away his FA Cup loser's medal that night, and he joined Juventus that summer.
Yeah, he did. I mean, I look back on this era of Arsenal with kind of in a bittersweet way, because obviously it was a big thing getting to finals. It was a massive deal winning the '79 Cup final, and yet you do think that one of the reasons that Brady left and Frank Stapleton left the following summer was because they thought that Arsenal weren't being sufficiently competitive enough in the transfer market. There was some rumours that they were going to sign Mark Lawrenson. I know that was discussed from Brighton. There were rumours that they were going to sign a Dutch international, not Cruyff, I forget his name. Was it Rensenbrink, perhaps?
Oh, he hit the post, didn't he? Yeah.
There was a lot of talk about that, but it didn't happen. They signed John Hollins, who was a very good player, but there was a feeling they Arsenal could and should have pushed for more in that era. I mean, Terry Neal always said that football wasn't as big a business as it was today, and that it wasn't regarded as being the Arsenal way, if you like, to splash huge sums of money on players. But I do think it's a kind of like a lost chance, because Arsenal were a very, very good team, and what they need is more depth of squad. And had they got that, they could have perhaps pushed on a bit more. But as you say, Brady left that summer, was replaced by he wasn't replaced, but Peter Nicholas came in from Crystal Palace to come in, and then Stapleton left, and the whole thing fell apart very, very, very quickly, which is very, very sad, I think, from an Arsenal fan's perspective in that era.
Yeah, certainly, a favourite like Liam Brady, who had, grown up at the club and everything else, leaving because he felt the ambitions of the club weren't quite in line with his own, a slightly familiar tale.
What I sometimes find galling in that era is that in David O'Leary's book, he says that when he was on international duty with the Republic of Ireland, that Brady and Stapleton would often say, what are you still doing at Arsenal? And O'Leary's the one who remained loyal. And I guess it's ironic that O'Leary is the only one out of the three who did end up with a championship medal, isn't he?
Yeah.
He got one in '89 and '91. I guess the best things come to those that wait. But it doesn't alter the fact that Arsenal should have pushed on after the early 80s and made more of it than they did.
There is an episode, if people want to go back and find it, there is an episode with Liam Brady, a big long interview I did with him last year, and we talk quite a bit about his decision to leave and why he left for Juventus. But John, listen, we better leave it there. Hopefully it's been good info for people. I mean, in fairness, it's not the like I said, there's no happy ending to this particular podcast, given the fact that we didn't win those finals. To win just one of four finals in 3 years is a bit unfortunate. Yeah, but it's very Arsenal, isn't it?
Yeah, very, very Arsenal. The outcome never quite meets the expectation.
Yeah. Well, look, I guess you would have it any other way, or you'd have it the other way around if you could, but that's not what we signed up for. John, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate your time.
Lovely. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed to John. You can find him on Twitter at Jon Spurling1, at Jon Spurling1. And if you're interested in some of the books that he's written, why not just call your local independent bookstore and ask them to order it for you? They'll be happy to do it, and they would be very grateful of the business right now. It might take an extra day or two to get the book in for you, but look, nobody's going anywhere for a little while, so you can just have some patience and just know that when the book arrives, you get a warm feeling in your heart that a local business has benefited from your transaction and the money hasn't gone in to swell the coffers and the profits of a non-tax-paying corporation who don't give a fuck about anything or anyone. But, you know, whatever you feel yourself, you do it your way. I'm not here to tell you what to do. Hope you enjoyed the show. Again, just please stay safe and stay healthy and stay well. We're keeping things going as much as possible on the site as we can. There's not a great deal of news, but there is a daily blog every day that will be there for you. We'll have the podcasts going throughout for as long as it takes. James and I will be here on Monday. We'll be recording an Arsecast Extra. And please join us for that. In the meantime, have a great weekend. Enjoy your living room or your back garden or your balcony or wherever it is you've got to hang out until we can all venture outside again. But please stay well, please stay healthy, and we'll catch you on the next one. Until then, cheers, bye-bye.
Welcome to Poetry Hour here on the BBC. Poetry is an art form which delights us, enchants us, and at times surprises us. Not simply through the words, but through their source and the delivery. Few would expect a former professional footballer to be a purveyor of this most majestic art form, but that is very much the case. Andrei Arshavin, in his new book, Mr. Kipling is My Dad, has captured something that few thought possible. Here he is in the studios of the BBC, reading from his book. The poem is entitled, I Hope a Bird Shits in Your Mouth.
I hope a bird shit in your mouth. I hope you swallow it. I hope a bird has a seed in its poo, and you swallow that too. Then I hope a tree grow in your neck, and you die gushing blood from every orifice. But mostly, I hope a bird shits in your mouth.